Absolutely. Welcome, everyone, to Ohio RCRC's Faith the Vote webinar. I know we have some attendees who are joining us in the webinar format, as well as folk who are live on Facebook. We just want to give you a few moments here to get settled and to get everybody in. As many of you know, we are being joined today by a fantastic group, a fantastic all-star panel of wonderful faith-oriented voting rights advocates. We have folks on the panel from the Ohio Council of Churches, from the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, and from Catholics for Choice. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce each of those individuals. But as we see people populating and getting into the webinar room, we're really excited today. If you have comments, questions, anything else that you'd like to share, feel free to put those into the chat or the Q&A. But my name is the Reverend Terry Williams. I am a faith organizer with Ohio RCRC, Ohio's Religious Voice for Choice. And I'm so excited to be here today with these fantastic panelists. I do want to, just before we get started, I want to give you a heads up about some resources that we have available for you already. If you check out ohiorcrc.org, at the top of that website, you can click on our voter toolkit. It's an Ohio voter toolkit. So everything you need to know about the election in Ohio is there and available. Just a reminder, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means we don't tell you how to vote. We just make sure that you know how you are able to cast a ballot. We're not here to endorse any partisan positions. We're just here to make sure that you have all the information you need to make your voice heard. So again, if you check out ohiorcrc.org and check out our voting rights advocate page, that's going to be available through the end of the election. And we're able then to direct you to any place that you need to go within the Secretary of State's website or other websites that might prove helpful. So as we join today, as we join together, we're going to have a great conversation about the intersection of faith and voting rights and how that intersection impacts reproductive health, rights, and justice. Today, we're joined by Reverend Brandi, by Gabby, and by Tiffany. I want to do the introductions here individually, though. So I want to give each one of our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. We have the Reverend Brandi Slaughter, who is joining us from the Ohio Council of Churches. Reverend Brandi, good morning.
Thank you, Reverend Terry, and thank you for this opportunity to be here. Certainly, we should all be like laying our life down for voting right now. It's one of the most important things that we can be doing. So I'm grateful to be here. I am the policy director for the Ohio Council of Churches, and I've been there a little over a year. My faith leaning is Pentecostal. I am a minister, ordained elder in the Church of God in Christ. I attend the Word Church here in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm just excited to talk about this issue. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Reverend Brandi. Gabriel Garcia-Vera is a worker in the field. I call you because I can't remember all of your titles, Gabby, with Catholics for Choice. Gabby, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. And hello to everybody. My name is Gabriel Garcia-Vera. I work at Catholics for Choice. My pronouns are anything as long as it's said respectfully. I'm the Domestic States Programs Manager there, which doesn't mean much to anybody except for me, because it's a fancy yet mysterious title. But I essentially run our state policy and advocacy work for the organization, working in the 25 to 30 states per year that we do advocacy on sexual and reproductive health at the intersection between faith and reproductive health. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and I am joining all of y'all currently from Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which I would be remiss to not acknowledge that today is Indigenous Peoples Day. And so the land that I am currently on is originally Sioux and Cherokee and Iroquois land. And I'm super excited to be with you all today.
Thank you so much, Gabby. We also have joining us an advocate from the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition, Tiffany Sigler Rumbalski. Tiffany?
Hi, everybody. My name is Tiffany, and I'm with the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition. And my spiritual background is really complicated. It is a smorgasbord of a lot of things. So I'm originally from Nebraska, Western Nebraska, Cornfield, Nebraska. But my hometown is known for the Union Pacific Railroad. So a lot of people in a union, hard workers. And I came here in 2002 with my husband and my baby girl who just registered to vote and voted. Okay, so she registered and was able to vote in the primary, so she voted by mail. And she just voted in her first presidential election by mail from BG. So shout out to Emma. And I have a 14-year-old who really wishes that I would stop talking about voting. And to entertain myself, because my kids do not find me entertaining, I have a inflatable T-Rex. He's very large. His name is Vinny Voter. You can find him and follow him on Instagram, Vinny Voter. And so my marching cry right now is that right now, your voice is your vote. Use it. It is your power. That's my mission. And we'll get into it.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And I'm excited that you brought an additional guest. Many of us have followed Vinny Voter and his work alongside you. We really appreciate all of our panelists today. And we're really going to get right into it. You mentioned, Tiffany, a great segue. Your voice is your vote. Vote and voice go together in our culture and indeed in our state here in Ohio. So many of us in Ohio, we know that election years mean lots and lots and lots of advertising and people pulling side to side and just this din, this cacophony of stuff. But through all of that, we know that voting is an essential part of who we are. It's an essential part of being heard. So as we gather here as people of faith, of different faiths, of sometimes questioning faith, my question to all of you as panelists is, why is the intersection of faith and voting important to you and your organization? Faith and voting coming together. Why is that so critical? What makes it essentially important for you?
Yeah. If I could start.
Please.
So I think there's this premise that we are all made in the likeness of God. And oftentimes you will find a sentiment that, oh, voting doesn't matter because my vote's not going to be counted. It doesn't change anything anyway. I just think as we are made in the image of God, we are important. Our voice is important. What we believe in is important. And voting is an essential way of sharing your opinion about who leads us, the policies that will result from their leadership. So just from a basic premise that we are all God's children, we're made and created in his or her image, however you view that, voting is an essential part of that. It's hard to be a person filled with faith and not recognize that you are important, valuable, and that your voice matters, your opinion matters. And this is a way for us to render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, participate in our political process.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think just seeing that everybody knows what their personal experience, their life circumstances, they know it best. And they can trust themselves to know that they can make an informed decision. So I think one of the stories of our time is that the people who are leading us, they don't necessarily know what's happening. And we can make informed decisions for ourselves because we know best. And we can trust other people to make decisions so they can decide, what happens to their bodies, who they vote for. We can trust them. We can trust women. And we can trust individuals. Yeah.
We can trust people to make decisions about their own bodies and their own lives. Gabby, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I think for us in particular, so much of the work that we do, oftentimes I tell people where I work and they're like, oh, well, that must be really interesting since you're not really Catholic. And I'm like, no, I'm really Catholic. And I think one of the most important things is, just because leadership within our institutions or our churches, our places of worship, even our political system aren't in alignment with our personal views, it doesn't mean that we're wrong. I think that the importance of voting is really about, for us especially, I think it's about that sacred contract that we make with God, right? The idea that our conscience is the thing that connects us to a higher power, and that it both informs our ability to make decisions for ourselves and about our bodies, but it also gives us the ability to connect, right, to something bigger than us. And I think that when we vote, right, we cast a ballot in good faith, right? Always in good faith of a greater good, to be in greater service to a community. And I think the other thing that I will just add is, I think while voting is like super important, there are tons of people that can't vote, right? Like folks that are formerly incarcerated, folks that are undocumented, and those people have just as much a stake in our process. They have just as much ability to throw down and lean into the opportunities to continue to educate and shape their communities as the people that vote, right? Every vote, every conversation in this election, every time you find yourself in struggle with an issue is an opportunity, I think, both from a faithful perspective, but an opportunity to also educate and bestow that gift onto someone else.
Absolutely. I love that phrase. It's a sacred contract in good faith. Oh, I just love it, because I think we are at a point where that sacred contract is something that has too often become a political football for partisans. I want to ask the panel here, when we start talking about things like voter suppression or efforts that politicians or groups of people might have to keep people from voting, how does that square not only with your faith, but your understanding of reproductive health rights and justice in our country today?
Well, I'll jump in. When you talk about voter suppression, again, I started with, we all have value. We're all made in the likeness of God. Suppression is about violently opposing someone's self-worth, excluding certain people from giving their opinion, participating in the citizenship, participating in our democracy. It is deplorable. There's no other word to say about it. But I think as people of faith, it is our job to also be prophetic, to speak truth to power. And when you see instances where people are being restricted, not able to participate in our country and the way our country was built on these concepts of equality and justice for all, we all have a role to play in ensuring that people are informed about how to vote, informed about laws concerning voting, knowing where they can go if they're experiencing some things at the polls or even before the polls. I'm a person of color. I'm a African-American female. My grandmother raised me for the first part of my life, and they migrated from the South, from Selma to be exact. And when you think about a not so distant history of people dying for this right and dying to preserve our ability to contribute to this country in this way, certainly when you say suppression, lots of emotions are invoked to me. So I don't want to take up all of the time, but I will say that just from a faith perspective, sometimes we say, oh, they're not suppressing my vote. So long as I vote, I'm okay. But democracy is better when everyone participates, and we have to do our part to ensure that people have the opportunity to weigh in on our leadership.
Amen.
Thanks. I want to start out with maybe a pitfall of spirituality. From like my experience, and I have done this myself, it's the spiritual bypassing. It's saying God is in control, so I don't need to participate, and nor do I need to care about other people participating. But I think that forfeits our responsibility here on earth while we live. We have a responsibility to other people, to our community. And so as I challenge myself, I'd like to challenge other people. Think about how they are spiritually bypassing their responsibility. Because we're here, and God has made us part of has given us the responsibility to be purposeful about our actions. So that's one thing. And another thing is I do trust myself to make decisions. I trust my daughter to make decisions. And I now trust other people to make decisions more than I have in the past. And that, I mean, that's been a big growth area, is that I've kind of woken up from my own little shell in my own little world to see other people, and they're human just like me. And so I think as people of faith, it's important we see other people in all their humanity as equal to us with the same opportunity to make decisions. And that needs to really inform our thinking about voter rights, as they have just as much value to have input into our democracy as all of us, if that makes any sense. Take that and do with it what you will, but those are my very unformed thoughts about the matter.
I think the other piece is when we talk about voter suppression, I think there is, from an optical perspective, oftentimes the smoke and mirrors that happens in politicking that becomes like relational shielding, right? People leaning in to be like, I'm a father, so I can't perpetrate sexism, or I am a person of faith, so of course this matters to me, or like, I have a Black friend, so like, of course I can't be racist. And like, there is this smoke and mirrors dance that happens, and especially around voter suppression in particular, right? And I think if nothing else, I want folks to understand that we are not only called to witness, but we are called to testify in those moments, right? Our responsibility, and for anyone that is sort of thinking like, well, maybe this doesn't apply to me, look up your like state House district, look up your state Senate district, and tell me that you think that you could represent all those people in that very nice, neat, gerrymandered district that you're probably in. Because we live in a country where, you know, as recently as last year, someone made a whole font type based on gerrymandered like districts, like state districts. And I think it is important to note that those districts are cut intentionally, right? Districts are cut and gerrymandered in such a way to skew an outcome. And we know that those outcomes oftentimes benefit the people that have continuously been in power in this country, right? Like there is a clear signal. It is not just noise. There is a shifting of the guard, and we are in that moment politically. And I think the only path forward, understanding that we are facing such adversity in relationship to voter suppression, is to show up and show up with such force that it is undeniable our will.
Absolutely. And I'm drawn to the question. Reverend Brandi mentioned that mentality that we sometimes encounter with folks that say, I don't want to vote because my vote's either not going to count or it's not going to matter. And that level of disempowerment that can be so tempting, I think, for people to resign to. I want to dig into that a little bit, because I feel like part of what religious life gives to the people who participate in it is a sense of hope. So I had a dear friend ask me this week, she said, how in the world do we live in a nation where 7 in 10 people support Roe versus Wade, but we're about to have 6 out of 9 justices on the Supreme Court that don't? And I found that profound, because what her real question was, what you were getting at, Gabby, how can we have views and perspectives within the populace that then don't get reflected in the electoral outcomes? What happens when the views of the people don't get reflected in electoral outcomes? How do you deal with that disappointment? How do you press forward in that kind of struggled time?
Well, what happens is protests, as we're seeing across the world. I mean, what happens is people take it to the streets. I am fortunate to have experienced some international ministry, some missions ministry. And my last trip to Kenya, there was a presidential election, and I arrived in Kenya. My flight was delayed, so in the evening. So I'm a little nervous because I'm in this country by myself with bags in the middle of the night. But what I learned from the paper the next morning is that there was protests in the airport, people being shot at, all of that, around the presidential election, because there were people who don't feel heard. Now, I'm not advocating for protests. I'm not advocating, for any rioting, any of that. I'm not advocating people shoot at people. Please don't get me wrong. But at the same time, you cannot have a government structure that ignores this populace forever. At some point, there has to be shifts to political power that will be reflective of the views of the populace. So that's, for me, it's not a question of, we just can't afford not to vote. Right. Because of what you just shared, because some folks in power just don't represent our interests. And I think sometimes as people of faith, we should be encouraging all that we can, that they matter, that you're important, get down here and do what you need to do, because you're going to see more of the same. And I think we all want a country, America has been the model government for many institutions across the world. And now is a time where we're being tested. And I think it's the church's responsibility to make sure that people know that they're valued, they're important, their voice, this is the way for your voice to be heard. I've had the luxury also of working in government affairs work for over a decade, working in a predominantly conservative environment. And I don't care if you're Black, brown, green, Republican, Democrat, moderate, somewhere in between. The reality is we have to hold our elected officials accountable. So, you know, part of it is at the ballot box, but part of it is maybe you don't represent my values because I'm not even reaching out to you to let you know what my values are. So, you know, we've had lots of protests, we've had lots of things happen. Now is your time to vote. Now is your time to position yourselves in positions of authority so that you can, you know, oftentimes we're thinking like, okay, I want to vote for this person so that they can represent me. When in actuality, when you're in a period of time where you're not being represented, your elected officials aren't bringing forth your value, then this is the time maybe that you should step up and become a leader at the ballot box, but even just serving in your community.
It's awesome. I think first we need to recognize that we're in the majority right now in the United States. Most of us want what we want. And we need to recognize that power. And if you haven't been down to your board of elections to even witness what's happening at early vote, go. I mean, there's hope. There is so much hope in seeing people show up to use their voice and vote. And that's where I'm getting my hope these days, is just seeing all of you. And knowing that we're in this together, that we care about each other. We care not only what happens in our personal lives, but in each other's lives, in our community's lives. And when you go to your county board of elections to see early vote, you see the people there hoping with their vote. And it's just such a wonderful feeling. Just do it. Just go.
Hope with your vote.
Hope with your vote.
Yeah. And I feel like there is a moment in all of our lives where we do have to make the decision about whether we're going to stay stuck in the place that we are, or whether we're going to move forward in hopeful action. Which is what I'm hearing from you, Tiffany, that, you know, we've got to keep that movement going, that movement in a good direction happening. I do want to go, you know, back to a question that you raised, Tiffany, just a little bit, because I want to hear a little more conversation about that kind of spiritual or religious fatalism. You know, God's in control, so I don't need to vote. I have a dear mentor who always says God doesn't get a ballot because God's not on the registration list, right?
Oh, I like it. Yeah.
I find interesting, but I think it speaks to that reality that for many people there is kind of a built-in escape of accountability valve when it comes to religious thought. What do y'all think about that idea that, well, you know, God's got it? You know, how do you see the role of people's theology in motivating or not motivating them to vote?
Well, I think in my personal experience, I've always had to experience the consequence of inaction or action. And I assume most people also do that. You know, they experience the pain of not doing the dishes. No, just like a silly but an everyday example, right? We have to deal with it. I mean, and it's the same in our public life as it is in our personal life. We're also experiencing devastating consequences of not taking climate action. I mean, there's things we have not been taking care of, and we feel them right now. And so I'm kind of just going by that it seems like God is letting us experience like the consequences, whether we've worked on stuff or not. I don't know. Anybody else want to add something to that?
Yeah, there's this saying, you can be so heavily minded that you're no earthly good. I don't know if you guys have ever heard that saying before. And I am fortunate that many of the congregations or denominations, jurisdictions that we work with at the council do get the importance of voting, do get the importance of moving forward. But you have to understand that if you look at history and you look back to the civil rights movements, there were some faith folks that were right on at the front of the line, and there were others that were like, like we don't want to touch that. We want to just engage in our spiritual growth and development. I think you're going to get people all over the park with how they feel they need to contribute. I mean, I think even in this environment, you see some entities of faith that are strongly, conservative leaning, and then you have some that are strongly liberal leaning. I just think the message is we all have to do our part. We all have to contribute to the world that we live in. And voting is one part of how we contribute, just like recycling is a part of how we contribute, just like paying taxes is a part of how we contribute. And I think we have to demystify or take away the fear of political things in the church. Jesus was political. There's no question. His whole ministry was one of that spoke against paradigms and shifted power. And so this kind of fear of the church that, oh, I can't educate about voting. No, you can't tell people who to vote for. No, you cannot do that. But you absolutely can encourage people to be responsible citizens. And so I think some of it is head in the sand because politics are uncomfortable. I don't understand. I have a fear for what I can do, what I can't do. But on the other hand, I just think we have a long way to go. How can we as people of faith just tell people and teach people how to contribute to the world? That's what this is really about. It's not about politics. It's not about, we're just gonna tap into the Spirit of the Lord and He's gonna do all things well. And we all have to put some work. Faith without works is dead. And part of having faith that your voice means something. I think that's what's important.
Yeah, and I think to add on that, especially, in so much of the work that we do, oftentimes, especially at Catholics for Choice, I think we find our like Catholic opinion in dissent, right, of the greater church hierarchy. And I think it's really important for folks to dig in, like, the Jesus that I knew, like, challenged authority, right? The Jesus that I knew walked amongst the people. The Jesus that I knew, like, threw down. And so we cannot secede our faith to folks that we know care not about the flocks that they tend, right? It is a convenient yet violent truth to believe that we can simply let the people who are in power continue to exist and function and steer public opinion about who people of faith are, right? And we know that the few do not speak for the many. And I think one of the things in particular, right, when we think about voting, for me, voting isn't just simply about an electoral process. Voting is about, like, I'm voting for my mother. I'm voting for my sister.
Yeah.
I'm voting for my chosen family that doesn't have the right to vote, right?
Yep.
I'm voting for, like, all those people in Florida who, like, even after passing Amendment 4 are still faced with a poll tax because the governor is deciding that, like, even though incarcerated, even though served time, even though has paid all the fines on their bills, that there still needs to be a poll tax. And that is not something new, right? We see that as a common trend and a thread throughout. But I think when we look at those moments, it is important for us to understand that, like, the church and wherever your place of worship is not simply its leadership. It is not a place, it is not a book, it is not a doctrine, it is a people, right? It is the people that sit in the pews that make the church. We are the church. And our opinion holds just as much weight in relationship to its connectedness that tethers it to God, as does our leadership. And so we have to really hold those things together to be able to really begin to deconstruct, right? Because I think there is a desire to say, like, you know what, it's an uncomfortable conversation, so I'm not going to lean in. When in fact, we need to lean in most when it is uncomfortable, because, you know, God doesn't give us a challenge that's more than, like, that's too much for us to handle. And I think that for me is something that I feel feels like so relevant now in this moment, but even just in our work around, as we like push our own religious institutions to be better, to do better, to like hold more space, to hold us in more warm embrace.
I like that. Who
Absolutely.
are you voting for?
You know, I'm
Yeah, I like that.
yeah, and I'm struck in this moment, you know, by the parallel between how there are forces in our society across many ideological spectra that don't trust individuals to make their own decisions. And you know, that is not solely in relation to repro, but it's in relation to voting too. There's a great parallelism, I feel, between the inability of many political forces to trust people to make their own reproductive health decisions and their simultaneous inability to trust people to make their own electoral decisions.
Yep.
We hear things like, well, I don't want everybody, or I want people to make their own health decisions, provided they're my kind of decisions or they're my kind of morality. Where do you see that interplay happening between, you know, personal rights for reproductive health and personal rights for voting? Do you see a parallel there, or do you see a parallel in another way?
That's a good question.
I mean, I think in relationship to the parallel on how those two things intersect is, I think it's important for us to understand that while our faith is important and it is the thing that maybe drives us as individuals, and it is the North Star that we use to guide us forward in relationship to our own morals, our ethics, our values, that does not mean that should be imposed onto other people. The conversation that I most often have this container in is, as a person of faith, I don't believe that my faith should somehow have to dictate how everyone else lives their life, right? Not everyone shares my faith. And it is both a disservice to my own faith, but it is a disservice to the people around me, right? To impose that will onto people. And so this idea that as we sort of move forward in the work, we must also continuously always push in relationship to secular pluralism, right? This idea that like we should be able to practice our faith when and how we choose, but that we should also not use our faith as the lens to impose upon which other people should live their life, or that their life should be taken into value. And I think that's really where we see so much of this play out. I mean, especially in relationship, when we elect people that disregard our humanity and shield themselves as people of faith, right? We know that, you know, they end up doing so much harm. And I just keep thinking to myself, my sister shared something with me the other day, and it said, I'm so tired of people running around with a mouth full of scripture and a heart full of hate. And I thought, wow, well, that really hits the nail on the head, because I think there are so many politicians walking around quoting scripture. And I'm not here to say like who is worthy or lesser or in more alignment with God. That is not my place, right? But what I can say is it is our moral responsibility to govern in a way that allows all of us to be free to practice our religion. And I think that sometimes the people that we vote into office forget that. They lose themselves in spite of that obligation to others, right? It is not just in service to our own moral compass, it is in service to our people.
Well, so I'm going to try to respond, but it's hard. It's a tough question. I think listening to our own lived experience, and just understanding that my lived experience is different from other people's, I think it can guide us. I think it can guide our public officials that they really need to stop talking and start listening to people. And knowing that our ideologies are not the same as what is lived out in the real world. And I'll use myself as an example, is that where I am right now was not where I was at 20 years ago. When I was starting my family, I mean, we can believe all we want, and then lived experience kind of hits us over the head. And that happened the second I got pregnant with my daughter. I had ideas of what it would be like, and it was not that idea. I had ideas of what parenting would be like, and it was not like that. And so when I see a group of males making decisions that affect all of us, I mean, my blood boils, because they don't know that lived experience for real. And that's true of every single representative. And you can't know everybody's lived experience. And be quiet and start listening to people. Just really start listening to people. We also need people that represent all swaths of life in government, please, so that at least we can bring a little bit more understanding to the table and then stand up for each other. So all that to say, we all just need to shut up and start listening to each other.
The only comment, only thing that I will add to what's already been said is that we are in a period of time where, and this is kind of to Tiffany's point, when she became pregnant, her mind changed and her perspectives changed. I think all of us on various issues are determining what our values are. I guess I want to say this clearly. I'm trying to think of the best way to say it. I guess, for example, defund the police. You know, that's something that people are saying, and people are they're either arising to the issue or finding out where they are on the spectrum. And I think we have to allow people the opportunity to do that. And I only talk about that in that way because, of course, our organization represents 17 different denominations who have lots of varied opinions about reproductive health, choice, all of that. And I just think it's all of our jobs to educate and allow people to kind of walk through their process. The council, we just hosted Anti-Racism Sunday on September 20th, and it was awesome. But it was so hard to pull together even programming on that issue. And I think reproductive rights, I think there are lots of issues that we can point to because people are so in various places in their walk, various places in their understanding, and we're constantly evolving as people. And that's the only thing that I think I can add to the question is, you mentioned parallels. I think just with all that we're experiencing in society, we're all thinking through what our positions are. Have our positions shifted since we started out, you know, our thinking around particular issues? So that's all I'll add.
Wait, Reverend Brandi, you mean we can change our minds about things?
Yeah, we have choice, free will. Thank the Lord.
Right? I think that's the novel thing that underlies any discussion about voting that we very rarely talk about, is that a system that constantly asks people to engage via voting presumes that people might change their minds about things. And that, you know, in our culture, that has somehow become a sign of weakness.
Yes.
Or political entrenchment, as opposed to a sign of real development. You know, there's this word in churchy circles called discernment, right? What do we think about the discerning voter? You know, we in Ohio, we always get called swing swing state, swing voters. There are some people who say, oh, Ohio's not a swing state anymore, because there are too many on one side than another, or, the ideology's permanently shifted. What do you think about people getting to make up their own minds and then coming back and saying, maybe I want something different this time? How do you view that? Reverend Brandi, you mentioned free will. How do you view that fate piece of free will in the ballot box?
Yeah, I thank you, Reverend Terry. I think it's real important that people do know that you brought out that point that you can change your mind. You can decide something different. But for me, what's most important is when you become a registered voter, when you participate in this process, you become an informed voter. We are just, and we have this unique opportunity. I try to look at the blessings. I count the blessings. COVID has been horrible in some ways. I experienced COVID personally. I had it. It is horrible. Yeah. But that being said, there is blessing in all of it. And the blessing is many of us for the first time are engaging in early vote, engaging in vote by mail, and have the ability to say, okay, I'm going to pull my ballot out and I'm going to look online and I'm going to research. I'm not just going to believe I'm not going to believe in any sample ballot that's handed to me. I am just going to sit down and actually vote my consciousness, vote my value, think about these things. And it's just a blessing that COVID has given us this ability. So yes, you can change your mind. But I think what's most important is showing up an informed and a discerning voter. Did you do the research on the issues? Don't just vote yes. What does it mean to vote yes? How will it impact you financially? How will it impact the system that this issue is put before us? Or who is this person who's running for office? Just because so-and-so says they're great, what is their background? What is their experience? And I think being able to early vote by mail, and really kind of lean into those opportunities, because we're kind of forced to lean into those opportunities. But the blessing is that we can, determine our own path. We don't have to be gullible voters. We can be informed voters.
Yeah, the path I was like 20 years ago is completely different than it is now. And, life changes people. And it's okay. It's human. Sometimes I see people like, I just want to see politicians or leaders who felt the same way now that they did 20 years ago. No, they're allowed to grow as much as we're allowed to grow. So it is okay. Because maybe you know things now that you didn't know then.
And Tiffany, it's hard though, because I'm middle-aged, right? And I'm looking at all of the younger folks who are now carrying the baton for many of these issues. And there are times where I'm stretched. I'm like, oh, I think that's a little bit too far.
It's true.
Maybe too radical, but I'm being stretched because we're constantly evolving and changing. And it's important, part of how this all works and plays out.
It is. Yeah, it makes my brain hurt. But yeah, this is a very difficult time. It's also a very growing time. And I kind of need some time off from it all.
After November the 3rd.
Yes, that's when I'm going to do my dishes. November 4th, I'm going to start doing the dishes.
Yes.
I think the other thing that is also important for us to kind of hold and really sort of think about is, again, and it's been said in so many different ways, but life is not as black and white as we would like for it to be. And the truth of the matter is that we show up in conversations and struggle with people. And just because we make an offering sometimes, it doesn't mean that someone's going to take it. And
I love that. You show up in conversations and you struggle with people.
Yeah, and I think the struggling through that difficult conversation is where the work happens. And at the same time, like, you know, and I think Elena said it beautifully in the chat, right? There's also, we also have to always be vigilant, right? Because the truth of the matter is that we cannot sacrifice people's lived experience and humanity as something that is up for debate, that is up for conversation. You know, I think so often, and especially in this sort of political moment, everything feels super polarized. And people are beginning journeys right now, I think, in so many different ways, both around their own engagement electorally, but also like in this country, we are actively having a conversation about race, racism, anti-Blackness that we have not really had in a very clear cut way, that we have not seen the engagement of non-Black and Brown and Indigenous folks lean into this conversation in a forward-facing way. And I think the other thing is that to show up in conversation with people also means to show up in conversation with people that look like us, that sound like us. We are the best stewards of that message, right? I think about the marriage equality fight, and in the first iteration and in the early years, right, the conversation was, well, did you know X number of LGBTQ people have families? And they didn't always say LGBTQ, and sometimes they left the T out, and they most of the time left the Q out at the very beginning. And, you know, and there were all these iterations of processes. And what actually changed the conversation around marriage for queer and trans people as a community was that we started telling our stories, right? We started talking with people that look like us. We were no longer these mythological ideas in people's heads about like, oh, but I don't know somebody. Well, you know, I think back so much to like Busy Phillips and her talking on her TV show, and even just saying, well, you know me. And I think about how I have that conversation both with myself, with the people in my church, and between me and God, right? Like that is more often than not, when I am deep in struggle, the conversation between me and God is, well, you know me. So isn't that where we begin?
Yeah.
And that has to be a part of the conversation, right? Because we have the ability to move people that share identity, affinity with us in a way that other people will never understand because they have a deep connection to us. And so we have to show up in those moments when we see our relatives, you know, saying something that's racist, when we see people saying information that we know is factually incorrect, when we witness someone being discriminatory, we have to show up and intervene. And we also cannot shy away from people because it is uncomfortable, right? I use the example all the time. I think I am so in love with being Puerto Rican, but I have seen on more than several occasions, right, someone share a video of someone basically acting super racist, and then at the end of the video they're like, well, I'm Puerto Rican, and and I'm like, and you don't want to be like, yeah, that's my people. But like, we have to come for our people. We have to claim our people even when it is uncomfortable. We have to claim our people, especially when it is uncomfortable, because that is when we need to do the work the most.
True. And can I just tell you, like, as a Gen Xer from Nebraska, middle child, confronting issues with people I love is probably the hardest thing for me to do. And I'm just hoping it gets easier. Because I don't know if you feel that, but you know, you're raised in a way that says, don't make waves. You don't question people. You play nice. I mean, that's like, it's like ingrained and in your brain. And it takes some practice. And I have hope with more practice, it'll get easier.
Absolutely. And, you know, that I think is really the key takeaway for me of this discussion. And it's what reminds me of why I do the work that I do and why Ohio RCRC does the work that we do. That having those difficult conversations with the people who we love, right next to the people who we've been next to our whole lives. That's what's going to transform and help to heal this culture of bitterness and division. That we've got to open ourselves to tell our stories. That's why we're here today, to talk about why these are the essential parts of who we are, and they are not going away. They inform all of what we do. Wow, such a fantastic discussion. I knew we'd have a great discussion with these three fantastic panelists. Again, I want to thank Reverend Brandi Slaughter, Tiffany Rumbalski, and Gabriel Garcia-Vera. You all three have just brightened my day, and I hope the days of all of those who are joining us right now in the webinar and on Facebook. This material will be available afterwards to share among different social networks and to put out into the world. I want us just to close, if we can, one more reminder that if you go to OhioRCRC.org/vote, you can check out our Ohio Voter Toolkit to get you all the information you're going to need for 2020 elections in Ohio. As we depart, I want to hear from each panelist a word or two about what gives you hope right now. What have you taken away from this time together that gives you hope?
Well, I'm hopeful that there are folks that are of like mind who want to encourage people to participate in our democracy, even though our positions, backgrounds might be varied. I'm hopeful for our young people. I love our young people. My whole career pretty much has been dedicated to young people and youth. And so I'm hopeful for just the leaders that they are. And I think my prayer for all of us who are here and all of us, those that are out there watching us, is that we do become more bold in encouraging people to step up in various different ways. And I'm just encouraged by the opportunity to educate more people to vote.
My hope is in all the people who are showing up to vote. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I think my hope is that we continue. I think the Reverend said it perfectly. That we continue to be bold, right? Like, I wanna like be in the future one day and be dreaming of like something that feels scary, right? Because I don't understand it. Like, we need to envision the type of future where we can thrive. And I think that doesn't happen without asking, without demanding for more than what we have, right? People that ask for breadcrumbs oftentimes show up to conversations starving. And we cannot impart that scarcity onto the people that come after us, because we see young people leading our movements and we see them asking for everything that they know they deserve. And I think that to me is something that not only gives me hope, but it also tells me that there's a signal, right? We need to be following and be in fellowship with young people just as much as we ask them to be in fellowship with us.
Yep.
And we need to be honoring their leadership. And so to me, that is something that consistently gives me hope.
Awesome. Thank you all three. We really appreciate your time with us, and we appreciate being able to be with everyone who has joined us. Thank you so much for joining Faith the Vote webinar today.